May Colton found her husband on a Tuesday in March, sitting in his favorite chair by the window with the television tuned to the afternoon weather and a cup of coffee still warm on the side table. She had been gone 40 minutes, maybe 45, long enough to walk to the corner market on Rue La Barre and back with a bag of groceries she would never unpack. The front door was unlocked the way it always was. The apartment smelled like the dark roast Walter bought in bulk from the Vietnamese grocery on Veterans Boulevard, and the light through the curtains fell across his face at the angle she had seen 10,000 times before, that soft golden slant that came in every afternoon around 3 and made him look younger than he was. His eyes were closed, his hands rested on the arms of the chair, his mouth was slightly open the way it looked when he dozed off during the news. And for a moment May thought he was sleeping. Thought she would set the groceries down and touch his shoulder. And he would stir and ask what she had bought, the way he always did, the way he had done every afternoon for 47 years. She set the bag on the kitchen counter. She called his name from across the room. She called it again from the doorway to the living room. Then she crossed the carpet and touched his hand and understood that the coffee was still warm, but the man who had made it was not. She did not scream. She did not collapse. She stood beside the chair and held his hand for a long time, feeling the warmth leave it, the way a tide pulls back from shore slowly, gently, without any sound. Then she picked up the phone and dialed 911 and told the dispatcher that her husband was dead, and gave the address and sat down in the chair across from his and waited. The paramedics arrived in 7 minutes. They were kind and efficient, and they told her it was his heart. And May thought yes, she could have told them that. She had watched Walter's heart say goodbye for years. She had watched it slow on small things, first the stairs he started avoiding, then the walks through the park they used to take on Sunday mornings, then the plans he stopped making, the trips. He stopped mentioning the future. He stopped talking about as though it had already happened, and he had simply forgotten to attend. 47 years. They had married in 1977 in a small ceremony at a church in Gentilly with 63 guests and a cake her mother had baked in a kitchen without air conditioning. Walter had been 26, May 25. He was handsome in the way that mattered, not striking but steady, a face you trusted before he said a word. He had started the jewelry shop 3 years later, with a loan from his uncle and $1,200 May had saved teaching 7th grade English at a public school in Jefferson Parish. She had kept teaching. He had kept building. 40 years of that, the two of them working parallel lives that converged every evening at the dinner table, where they would talk about the shop and the students and the mortgage and the children and the small ordinary things that become enormous when they stop. The funeral was on a Saturday. 200 people came. Customers from the jewelry shop who had bought engagement rings and anniversary gifts and graduation watches over 3 decades. Neighbors from the apartment building on Metairie Road where May and Walter had lived for 40 years. Relatives who had not called in months but who stood in the receiving line with the particular gravity of people who know they are late but hope no one has noticed. The church was full. The flowers were white and yellow. The priest spoke about Walter's faith and his generosity and his devotion to his family, and most of it was true. May stood beside the casket and thanked every person who came. Her feet ached in the black shoes she had not worn in 2 years. Her chest felt hollow as if the paramedics had taken something out of her along with Walter's body. But she stood because that was how it was done. You stand, you shake hands. You say thank you for coming, and yes, he was a good man, and yes, it was sudden. You do not sit down, you do not close your eyes. You do not tell anyone that the apartment smells wrong now that it smells like a place where only one person lives, and that the smell arrived before the funeral director had even taken the body away. Her eldest son, Derek, 49 years old, managed the arrangements with an efficiency that May recognized. It was the same efficiency Walter had used to run the shop when he was young. The same brisk competence that could make a customer feel attended to and dismissed in the same handshake. Derek wore a navy suit and stood at the entrance of the church and greeted every mourner with the precise solemnity of someone who understood that grief properly performed was indistinguishable from authority. He had inherited Walter's jaw and his hairline, and his ability to fill a room simply by standing in it. But he had inherited something else too, something May had only recently begun to name: a talent for making his interests look like everyone else's responsibilities. She noticed him step into the hallway during the second reading. She saw him through the glass partition, his phone pressed to his ear, his back turned to the congregation. His voice was low, but his posture was tight, the kind of tightness that had nothing to do with mourning. She caught fragments, the words payment and 6 weeks and after the estate paperwork. And then Derek glanced over his shoulder and saw her watching, and turned further away and finished the call and came back inside and sat down and folded his hands as though nothing had happened. May did not ask him about the call, not that day, not ever. But she filed it the way she had filed 37 years of classroom observations, quietly, precisely in a place where she could find it when she needed it. Her daughter Lynette, 45, had flown in from Atlanta with her husband. Lynette cried during the service with a cloth handkerchief May had never seen her use before, a prop so perfectly chosen it looked borrowed from a period film. Lynette's tears arrived at the right moments and departed at the right moments and left no mess on her carefully applied makeup. And May watched them the way she used to watch her students rehearse a speech, with a mixture of recognition and exhaustion. There was one other moment that day that May would remember later, much later, when everything else had fallen into place, and she was looking back at the funeral not with grief, but with the particular clarity that distance provides. An older man, a stranger, approached her in the receiving line. He was tall and weathered, with liver spots on his hands and a suit that had been well made 20 years ago. He took May's hand and held it, and looked at her face as if searching for someone else inside it. His voice barely carried above the organ music. "Did you know your father well, Mrs. Colton Earl Dupree? I bought from him 40 years ago. He was an artisan." Then the man released her hand and moved through the crowd and out the side door, and was gone before May could ask the question that had already formed on her tongue. Bought what? Earl Dupree had been a farmer on 60 acres of Louisiana swampland that did not produce enough to feed a family. A quiet man who drove the same truck for 20 years and repaired his own boots with shoe glue, and never once in May's entire childhood spent money on anything that was not strictly necessary. What had he been selling? And to whom? And why had this stranger at Walter's funeral known about it when May, his own daughter, had not? She did not think about it long. Grief has a way of swallowing questions the way the Gulf swallows small boats, slowly and completely, until the surface is smooth again and you forget there was ever anything underneath. 2 weeks later, Derek called. He used the words family meeting, which May had never heard him use before, and which landed in her ear with the weight of something rehearsed. She drove to Derek's house in Metairie, the same house she and Walter had helped him buy 12 years earlier, with a down payment that had come from the jewelry shop's best year, and she sat at the dining room table across from her 2 children. Lynette had a folder. Derek had a legal pad. His expression was one May could not immediately read, something between determination and the careful blankness of a man who has already made his decisions and is now simply performing the announcement. Derek's voice was measured. "Mom, we need to talk about Dad's estate." May nodded. She had expected this. Lynette opened the folder. "We've reviewed everything, the apartment, the accounts, the shop. We want to make sure it's all handled properly." May looked at the folder and recognized Walter's handwriting on the tab. They had been in his desk. They had already gone through his desk. Derek straightened in his chair. "The apartment. Dad put my name on the deed 9 years ago after his first cardiac episode. It was an estate planning decision." May remembered signing papers that week. She remembered signing them at the kitchen table while Walter was still in the hospital, while the smell of disinfectant was still on her clothes, and the cardiologist's voice was still echoing in her ears, saying the words significant blockage and lifestyle adjustments. Derek had come to the apartment with a folder, not unlike the one Lynette held now, and had laid the papers on the table and pointed to the tabs marked with yellow arrows. and had explained that it was a precaution just in case Dad's condition worsened, a way to avoid probate, nothing to worry about, just sign here and here and here. May had signed without reading. She had just spent 5 nights sleeping in a chair beside her husband's hospital bed. She was exhausted and frightened, and she trusted her son the way you trust a hand that reaches for you in the dark instinctively completely, without checking whose hand it is. Now 9 years later, sitting at Derek's dining table, she understood. The hand had not been reaching for her. It had been reaching past her. "I remember signing that," May heard herself say. Derek's tone was the tone of a man presenting reasonable options. "I'm not asking you to leave immediately, Mom, but Karen and I have been thinking. The kids are growing. We need the space, and the upkeep on that apartment is considerable for someone living alone." Karen was Derek's wife. She had been part of the family for 19 years, long enough to stop pretending she enjoyed holiday dinners at May's apartment, and short enough to still smile when she thought someone important was watching. "You want me to leave the apartment where I've lived for 40 years? Not leave, transition. Lynette found a very nice place near the lake. Modern, safe, staffed." Lynette leaned forward with the expression of someone offering a gift she expected to be refused. "Nobody's saying you can't take care of yourself, Mom. We just think it would be more comfortable, safer, people around." "And the bank accounts?" Derek and Lynette exchanged a glance. Not the glance of siblings consulting each other, the glance of partners confirming they were still on script. "We transferred them to a trust for estate management. Lynette and I are co-trustees." May sat very still. She looked at the legal pad where Derek had written the word trust in his architect's handwriting, precise and angular. The way Walter's had once been before age had softened it. She looked at Lynette's folder with its neatly labeled tabs. She thought about every late night she had spent doing the shop's books, while Walter stood at the counter, attending to customers' every anniversary trip they had cancelled, because the shop needed new display cases every dollar they had set aside. So Derek could go to Tulane and Lynette could go to Emory, every luxury foregone, every small deprivation that had felt like investment, and now revealed itself as donation. They had divided 47 years in a single afternoon. The work of 2 lifetimes partitioned with yellow tabs and legal pads by the 2 people those lifetimes had been spent building. The car. Lynette needs it while hers is in the shop. And Mom, you barely drive. There are excellent transportation services. May looked at her children. She studied them the way she used to study a classroom of 7th graders on the first day of school, reading faces for intent, for evasion, for the particular brand of cruelty that children mistake for practicality. She found it in both of them. In Derek, it looked like competence. In Lynette, it looked like concern. But underneath it was the same thing. The cold arithmetic of people who have decided that what you built belongs to them because they were the reason you built it. "Is there anything left for me?" The question was quiet, not weak. Quiet the way a judge's voice is quiet when the verdict has already been decided, and the words are just formality. Derek checked his notes. Grandfather's place, the Louisiana property. The county sent letters about back taxes a few years ago. We didn't respond. It's assessed at less than what's owed. His name was Earl. Right, Grandpa Earl's place. It's about $14,000 in back taxes. Swampland, Mom. The house has been falling apart for years. How much in back taxes? Around 14,000. It's not worth anything. May looked past her children at the window behind them. Outside the oak tree she and Walter had planted the year Derek was born, filled to frame its branches bare in the March cold. She had pruned that tree herself for the first 5 years. Now it was taller than the house. "I'll take it." Derek blinked. His pen stopped. "Take what?" "The property. I'll take it." Lynette leaned forward. "Mom, there's nothing there. No running water, no reliable electricity. The house has been abandoned for years." "You said it's mine. My father left it to me. Not to a trust. Not to you. To me." It's literally a debt. Then you won't mind me keeping it. Neither of them argued. There was nothing to argue about. They had taken the apartment, the money, the shop, the car. The Louisiana property was a footnote, a line item representing a loss nobody wanted to claim. Giving it to May was not generosity. It was disposal. May left Derek's house that evening, with her handbag, her coat, and her father's pocket watch. She had carried the watch since Earl died 24 years ago. It was silver heavy, the kind of weight that tells you the metal is real. Inside the cover, 5 numbers were engraved, scratched into the silver. By hand, the lines uneven in a way that meant they had been made with a tool not designed for the purpose, a nail perhaps, or the tip of a small file. May had always assumed they were a date, but they didn't match any date she could find. Not a birthday, not an anniversary, not a year that meant anything she could identify. 5 digits in her father's hand pressed into silver, carried in her pocket for 24 years without explanation. Earl had placed the watch in her palm during her last visit to the property. The visit she had made when he was 80 years old and dying of kidney failure, and sitting on the porch of the house he had lived in for 60 years, looking out at the shed he had kept locked her entire life. His hand had been shaking, but his grip was firm. "Keep this, May." His voice had been thin, reduced by illness to its essential frequencies, but his eyes were sharp and they held hers. "You'll know when you need it." "Need it for what, Daddy?" Earl did not answer. He looked out at the shed for a long time, and then he said one more thing, and it was the last real thing he ever said to her. Because after that afternoon, his mind began to wander, and within 3 weeks he was gone. "Don't let anyone take this land. Promise me." May had promised. She had not understood why. The land was 60 acres of swamp and scrub pine, and a house that needed more repairs than it was worth. She had promised because you promise a dying man what he asks, and you figure out the reasons later. 24 years later, she was still figuring. May stayed in Derek's guest room for 3 weeks. They made her feel it every single day. Not with cruelty, not with harsh words, but with the slow, deliberate weight of inconvenience. Karen sighed when May used the kitchen in the mornings, a small exhalation precisely calibrated to be heard and precisely deniable as involuntary. The children were instructed not to make noise because Grandma needs her rest, which meant that Grandma was aware every hour that her presence had rearranged the household in ways nobody welcomed. Derek left brochures on the nightstand. Sunrise Village, Meadow Pines, Golden Horizons. Names engineered to make you forget you were being warehoused. Each brochure featured photographs of silver-haired people laughing on manicured lawns with the kind of joy that only exists in marketing materials. The joy of the staged, the managed, the contained. On the 15th night, May woke at 2 in the morning and went to the kitchen for water. The hallway was dark, but light bled from under Derek and Karen's bedroom door, and voices came through the gap, not loud but taut. The pitch of people arguing in whispers because someone might hear. Karen's voice had the flat edge of a woman who had been patient for exactly as long as she intended to be. "She can't stay here indefinitely, Derek." "I know. So when? How much longer?" A pause. Then Derek, and his voice was different now. Stripped of the boardroom confidence May had heard at the family meeting, reduced to something rawer, something tired. "I need to sell the apartment this quarter, the loan on the shop. If I can't cover the next payment." "Then what?" "Then I lose the shop. I lose everything." May stood in the hallway holding an empty glass and understood something she had not wanted to understand. Derek was not just greedy. Derek was drowning. The jewelry shop he had taken over was bleeding money. The apartment whose deed bore his name was collateral for a debt she had known nothing about. Her son had not stripped her of everything because he was cruel. He had stripped her because he was desperate, and desperation makes people dangerous in ways that cruelty never does, because desperate people believe their own justifications. She went back to the guest room without drinking the water. She sat on the edge of the bed in the dark and looked at the brochures on the nightstand and made a decision. She would leave. Not because she was being pushed, but because she was choosing. There is a difference, and at 72 after 47 years of marriage and 37 years of teaching and a lifetime of standing when she wanted to sit. May knew the difference the way she knew her own heartbeat. On the morning of the 22nd day, she packed her suitcase. One suitcase. Everything she owned at 72 years old fit inside it. 3 changes of clothes, a nightgown, toiletries, 2 photographs, one of Walter on their wedding day, one of Earl on the porch of the Louisiana house, the pocket watch, a paperback novel she had been reading for 2 months and was still only halfway through because she kept rereading the same passages. $62 in cash. She left a note on the kitchen table. Going to Daddy's property. Don't worry about me. She did not say goodbye to Derek or Karen or the children. She walked out of the house at 6:30 in the morning, while the street was still dark and the azaleas along the walkway were just beginning to show color. And she carried her suitcase to the Greyhound station on Loyola Avenue in New Orleans and bought a ticket to Bardwell, Louisiana. The ticket cost $43. She had 62. The bus smelled like dust and old plastic, and the particular weariness of vehicles that have carried too many people too many miles without rest. May sat by the window and watched the city peel away. Metairie became Kenner. Kenner became the airport corridor with its chain hotels and rental car lots. Then the suburbs ended, and the wetlands began, that vast flat expanse of marsh grass and standing water that stretches north and west from New Orleans like a second sky laid on the ground. The highway rose on stilts over the Bonnet Carré spillway, and May looked down at the water and the cypress trees standing in it like monuments to something that had been submerged too long to remember what it was. She did not cry. She had already cried. She had cried on the 3rd night in Derek's guest room at 3 in the morning, with the pillow pressed against her face so no one in the house would hear. She had cried with the thoroughness of someone who understands that this is the last time, that after this, the tears will be gone, and what remains will be something harder and more useful. She had cried for Walter, for the apartment, for the shop she had helped build, and the money she had helped save, and the children she had raised who had repaid her with brochures for assisted living and a bus ticket's worth of cash. She cried until the pillow was wet on both sides. Then she turned it over and slept. And when she woke, she was finished with crying the way you are finished with a season. It passes, you move on, the weather changes. The bus arrived in Bardwell at 11:14 in the morning. Bardwell was barely a town, 2 streets that crossed each other at a blinking yellow light. A hardware store, a pharmacy with a faded awning, a white wooden church with a steeple that needed paint, a diner that opened at 6 and closed at 2, its windows clouded with decades of grease vapor. The bus stopped at the gas station at the eastern edge of town, and May stepped down onto cracked asphalt with her suitcase in her hand and the sun on her face and $19 in her pocket. She asked the attendant about the Dupree property north of town. He was young, maybe 25, with oil-stained hands and a trucker cap pushed back on his forehead. He looked at her the way you look at someone who has asked for directions to a place you did not believe still existed. Old Earl's Place, that's about 4 miles up County Road 14. Nobody's been out there in years. He studied her. You family. I'm his daughter. He nodded slowly. Didn't know Earl had people who visited. May walked. 4 miles along a road with no shoulder and no shade, the asphalt crumbling at the edges into gravel, and the gravel giving way to grass, and the grass giving way to the ditch, where brown water moved slowly towards somewhere she could not see. Her suitcase bumped against her leg with every step. The handle dug into her palm. She switched hands every quarter mile. The sun climbed and the air thickened with humidity, and the sound of insects rose around her like a wall of noise that had no source and no edge. A pickup truck slowed beside her after the first hour. A middle-aged woman with short gray hair and work boots leaned across the passenger seat. Need a ride, ma'am? Almost there. Where's there? The Dupree property. The woman's eyebrows rose. Earl's place, you sure about that? May nodded. The woman held her gaze for a moment, then shrugged and drove on, and May watched the truck disappear around a curve and kept walking. It took nearly 2.5 hours. By the time she saw the driveway, her feet were blistered inside her shoes, and her blouse was dark with sweat, and her right shoulder ached from the suitcase. The driveway was barely visible, choked with weeds and young hackberry trees that had pushed through the gravel over decades of neglect. She turned onto it and walked the last 200 yards and stopped at the edge of the clearing and looked at what her children had given her, because it was the only thing they did not want. The house sat at the end of the drive, a two-story wooden structure that had once been white. The paint had peeled away on most of the walls, curling in long strips that hung from the clapboards like dead skin. Two upstairs windows were broken, their glass scattered in the weeds below. The porch sagged on the left side where the supports had rotted through, and the railing leaned outward at an angle that suggested it had been leaning for so long it had forgotten what straight looked like. The front steps were intact but soft, the wood spongy with moisture. A wasp nest the size of a football hung from the eave above the door. Behind the house stood the shed. May's eyes went to it, immediately pulled by a gravity she did not fully understand. It was large, steel-sided, what they called a hangar in this part of Louisiana, built for equipment or livestock, or whatever a farmer needed to keep dry. It had been dark green once. Now it was faded to a color between gray and nothing. The roof had partially collapsed on the east side, and steel sheets hung at angles from the frame like broken wings. A steel door on the west side was sealed with a heavy padlock, rusted but intact. Earl had never locked the house. He had never locked the truck. He had never locked anything in his life except this shed. May set her suitcase on the ground and stood there. $14,000 in back taxes. A house that might not survive another summer of Louisiana humidity. A shed her father had kept sealed her entire life. And $19 in her pocket. She picked up the suitcase and walked to the front door. It was unlocked. It had always been unlocked. Inside, dust covered everything like a second layer of paint. The air smelled of damp and mildew, and the particular stillness of a place that has been breathing alone for too long. She walked through the room slowly. The kitchen still had dishes in the cabinets. Blue floral china she remembered from childhood. The same plates her mother had served Sunday dinner on when May was 8 years old, and the world was small enough to fit inside this house. The living room had Earl's armchair, worn leather, the color of tobacco, positioned facing the window that looked out toward the shed. Not toward the fields, not toward the road, toward the shed. May stood behind the chair and looked through the window and saw what her father had seen every day for decades. The steel walls, the padlocked door. The secret he had watched over from this exact position, for reasons she did not yet know. She tried the fuse box. Nothing. She tried the kitchen faucet. Dry. She sat in her father's chair and looked toward the shed and listened to the house settle around her. The wood creaking, the roof ticking in the afternoon heat. The sound of a place remembering that someone was inside it again. That first night, she slept on the mattress in Earl's room. It smelled of dust and old wood, but it held her weight without complaint. She covered herself with a quilt she found in the closet. A quilt her mother had knitted before May was born. The yarn faded to colors that no longer had names. The seams coming apart in places where the stitching had surrendered to time. It was warm. That was enough. She woke at dawn to birdsong and swamp frogs and the creak of the house on its foundation. She lay still and listened for a long time, the way you listen to music. You have not heard in years, recognizing it not in your mind, but in your body, in the way your breathing slows and your hands unclench, and the muscles along your spine release a tension you did not know they were holding. Then she got up and started cleaning. 3 days. She swept every floor. She wiped every surface with rags torn from a bedsheet she found in the linen closet. She scraped mold from the bathroom tiles with the handle of a spoon, working on her knees for hours, her back aching, her fingers raw. She carried armloads of dead leaves and bird nests and the desiccated remains of small animals out of the corners where they had accumulated over years of abandonment. She burned everything in a pile in the backyard, and the smoke rose straight up into the windless sky like a signal. On the second day, a woman who lived a kilometer to the south saw the smoke and drove over in a pickup truck. She was heavy-set with kind eyes and a voice that carried the particular directness of people who live far from town. "You living here?" "I am." "Water's been shut off. You'll need to call the county. Electric too." "How much?" "Couple hundred with deposits." May had $19. 200 was a wall with no door. But the next morning, she found an envelope in the mailbox. No return address, no name. Inside, $300 in $20 bills, folded once, and a piece of paper with handwriting that was shaky but deliberate, each letter formed with the care of someone who understood that penmanship was a form of respect. Earl Dupree was a good neighbor. Welcome home. May stood by the mailbox, holding the money and the note. The road was empty. The field stretched flat and green in every direction. She did not know who had sent it. She did not need to know. There are moments when the world hands you something without explanation, and the correct response is not to question it but to accept it and keep moving. She called the county from the neighbor's phone and paid the deposits and got the water and electricity reconnected. The water ran brown for 20 minutes, then cleared. The electricity worked in every room except the upstairs bathroom, where the wiring had been chewed through by something with small teeth and persistent hunger. She found canned goods in the cellar. Mason jars of preserved vegetables Earl had sealed years ago, their lids still tight, their contents still edible. She cooked her first meal on the old gas stove, black beans and rice with canned tomatoes. And she ate alone at the kitchen table with the window open and the evening air coming in and the shed visible through the glass, its steel walls catching the last of the daylight. May remembered being 11, a summer afternoon, hot and slow, the kind of day when the air itself seems to thicken into something you have to push through. She had walked around the side of the shed and found a gap in the steel siding, a place where two sheets did not quite meet, and she had pressed her face to the gap and tried to see inside. The interior was dark. She could make out shaped shelves perhaps, or stacked boxes, and a smell came through the gap that she had never encountered before, something herbal and sweet and faintly acidic like vinegar left in the sun. Then Earl's hand was on her shoulder, and she was being pulled back, and he was shouting the only time in her life he had ever raised his voice at her. His face was not angry. She understood that now, 40 years later, replaying the memory with the clarity of a woman who had spent decades reading faces for a living. His face was afraid, not angry, afraid. The fear of a man who has built a wall between his daughter and something he cannot name and has just watched her try to look over it. "There's nothing in there for you, May." His voice had been sharp and then immediately soft, the way thunder follows lightning and then fades. "Nothing in there. You understand." She had understood only that her father was frightened, and that frightening him was the worst thing she could imagine doing. She never tried to look inside the shed again. But now she was 72 years old and sitting in her father's chair with nothing left. No apartment, no money, no car, no husband, no children, who wanted her for anything other than what she could be persuaded to sign away. She had kept her promise for 24 years. She had honored his silence because she believed silence was how Earl loved, the way some people love by holding tight, and some people love by letting go, and some people love by building walls around the things they cannot bear to share. But a promise made to a dead man has a shelf life, and May had reached it. She sat in Earl's chair on the 7th evening and held the pocket watch in her palm. She turned it over and opened the cover and looked at the 5 numbers scratched into the silver. She ran her thumb across the grooves, feeling each one the way you read Braille, with the tips of your fingers searching for meaning in a language you have not yet learned. 5 numbers, not a date, not a code she recognized. 5 digits her father had carved into silver with a steady hand and then pressed into hers and said, You'll know when you need it. Tomorrow she would open the shed. She did not know what she would find. She knew only that Earl Dupree had held onto this land for 40 years while driving the same truck and wearing the same boots and living like a man with nothing. And there was a reason. And the reason was behind that door, and she was going to find it. She closed the watch and put it in her pocket and sat in the dark and listened to the house breathe around her. Outside the shed stood in the moonlight, steel and shadow, a question her father had asked with his whole life and left for her to answer. The sledgehammer she found in the cellar was small, meant for fence posts or stubborn nails, not for breaking padlocks of steel doors. But it had weight, and weight was all she needed. May carried it across the yard on the 8th morning, with the sun still low and the dew still thick on the grass, and the air carrying the smell of the swamp, that mixture of rotting vegetation and standing water, and something alive underneath it all, something green and persistent and older than anything man-made. She wedged the head of the hammer behind the padlock hasp and pulled. The screws held. She adjusted her grip and pulled again, harder, putting her legs into it the way she had once pulled stubborn file cabinet drawers in classrooms that hadn't been renovated since the Kennedy administration. The screws resisted for another moment, then tore free from wood that had been softening in the Louisiana humidity for decades. The padlock clattered to the concrete apron in front of the door and lay there, rusted orange and suddenly purposeless, like a guard who has been relieved of a post he no longer remembers being assigned to. May pushed the steel door open. It moved heavily on its track, grinding against rust, and daylight entered the shed for what might have been the first time in 20 years. The beam of morning sun cut across the interior and illuminated what it found in slices. Fallen beams in the collapsed east wing, gray ancient hay covering most of the floor, compressed by years into something that was no longer hay, but not yet dirt. Tools hung on the walls, their metal surfaces so thoroughly rusted that they had crossed the boundary between useful objects and abstract sculpture. A long workbench stood against the far wall, buried in debris. May stepped inside, carefully testing each footfall before committing her weight. The floor was solid, too solid. She stopped. She looked down. She swept hay aside with her foot and saw concrete. Smooth poured continuous concrete extending from where she stood toward the walls in every direction. She swept more hay, more concrete. She crossed the shed, slowly kicking debris aside as she went, and the concrete continued wall to wall, unbroken, without cracks or joints. Clearly the work of someone who knew how to mix and pour and finish a slab. This was wrong. She had lived in Louisiana her entire life, and she knew what belonged inside a farm shed and what did not. Dirt floors belonged. Wooden planks belonged. A poured slab, smooth and professional and extending corner to corner, without a single flaw, did not belong. Not unless someone had put it there for a reason. Not unless someone was trying to keep whatever was underneath from being found. She walked the perimeter, kicking hay aside with methodical patience. The concrete was consistent everywhere. Near the northwest corner, the surface changed. Slightly smoother, perhaps more recent, though still decades old. And when she stamped on it, the sound changed. Everywhere else her footfall landed with the dull thud of solid mass. Here the sound was different. Hollow, resonant, the sound of a drum. May knelt and pressed her ear to the floor. She knocked with her knuckles. The echo came back from somewhere below, deep and round, the acoustic signature of enclosed space. Not a pocket, not a gap, a room. She sat back on her heels and stared at the floor. Her father had poured a concrete slab in his shed and sealed something beneath it, something he had guarded for decades, something he had shouted at his 11-year-old daughter to protect. May pulled the pocket watch from her jacket and turned it over. The 5 numbers caught the light filtering through the broken roof. If these were not a date, if they were not an inventory number, if they were not a memorial or a keepsake, then what were they? A combination, a key, instructions for something that required 5 numbers to open. She could not break through this concrete alone. She needed tools she did not have and strength she could not manufacture. She needed someone she could trust, and trust was a commodity she had recently learned to audit more carefully. Guidry's Hardware sat on the main street of Bardwell, between the post office and a barber shop that had been closed for 3 years, but still had a faded pole spinning in its window. May arrived walking at 8 in the morning. The bell above the entrance chimed with the thin brass sound of a bell that has been chiming for 40 years and has no intention of stopping. The man behind the counter looked up from a newspaper. He was in his 60s, thick through the chest and thin through the hair. "Help you find something? I need a 9-pound sledgehammer and a steel pry bar." He studied her. May was 5'2" and 120 pounds and 72 years old, and asking for demolition tools with the matter-of-fact tone of someone ordering coffee. "What are you breaking?" "A concrete floor." "Concrete." He pointed toward the back. "Aisle 3. Get the 9-pound sledge, not the 18. Save your back." May found the tools and brought them to the counter. The sledgehammer was $38. The pry bar was $16. She had about $90 left. The $300 from the anonymous envelope had covered the utility deposits and reconnection fees, and the groceries and coffee grounds and cleaning supplies of the first week had taken the rest down to a number that made every purchase a negotiation between need and survival. $54 for the chance to answer a question her father had buried under concrete. She counted the bills twice and decided that some answers are worth going hungry for. She was paying when the door opened and a man walked in carrying a box of wood screws. He was tall and broad through the shoulders with close-cropped gray hair and hands that showed decades of physical work. The knuckles enlarged, the fingers slightly curved. Even at rest, the skin mapped with small white scars from tools that had slipped and wire that had snapped. He wore a denim jacket faded to the color of a winter sky and boots caked with dried mud. He set the screws on the counter, and his eyes moved to May's purchases and stayed there. "That's a lot of sledgehammer for one person." "I'll manage." "Which shed?" May hesitated. Something in the way he said which shed, not what shed suggested, he knew the area well enough to know which structures might have concrete floors that didn't belong. "Earl Dupree's place, County Road 14. The shift in his face was immediate. Not surprise exactly. Recognition, the way a word you haven't heard in years triggers a cascade of memories the moment it reaches your ear. Earl's place. He was quiet for a moment. "I haven't been out there in a long time. Are you his daughter, May?" "Yes." "Henry Thibodeau." He extended his hand. It was dry and rough, and the handshake was firm without being performative. "I live about 3 miles north of your property. Your father and I used to have coffee sometimes when he came into town. He was a quiet man." A pause. "Good company, though." That was him. Henry looked at the sledgehammer again. "What are you looking for in that shed?" May thought about lying. She thought about saying she was cleaning up, clearing out. But she was too tired for lies and too old for pretense, and something about the directness of Henry Thibodeau's question made her want to match it. "There's a concrete slab in the shed. I need to see what's underneath it." Concrete in a shed in Louisiana. He let that sit. That's unusual. "I know. Are you going to swing a 9-pound sledge at concrete by yourself?" "I was planning on it." Henry looked at her for a long moment. Then he spoke, and his voice had the settled quality of a man who has made a decision and does not need to explain it. "I've got a pneumatic hammer in my workshop. Runs off a compressor. It'll save you a week of work and probably a trip to the emergency room." "Why would you help me?" "Because your father was a good man, and because swinging a sledgehammer at concrete at 72 alone in a shed with no phone is the kind of decision that makes for a short obituary." May felt something move in her chest that she had not felt in months. Not gratitude exactly, recognition. The recognition that decency still existed in the world, that it could arrive unannounced in a hardware store on a Tuesday morning, in a town with one blinking traffic light. "I can't pay you." "I didn't ask you to." Henry arrived at 6:45 the next morning. His truck was a Ford pickup that had been dented and scratched by so many years of work that the damage had become a texture like bark on a tree. The compressor and the pneumatic hammer were secured in the bed with ratchet straps. May had the drip coffee maker, running the first real coffee she had made in the house using grounds she had bought in town with careful attention to the cost per ounce. The smell filled the kitchen and drifted out through the screen door onto the porch. And when Henry came up the steps, he stopped for a moment and breathed it in as though the coffee were not a beverage, but a signal that the house was occupied again. They sat on the porch and drank in silence. The morning was cool. The sky was pale gray over the wetlands and herons moved through the mist toward the water. Their wings slow and deliberate, their reflections sliding across the surface like shadows of something better. Henry held his mug with both hands, the way people do when the warmth matters more than the coffee. I helped your father fix this porch about 25 years ago. He did most of the work himself. Just needed someone to hold the boards while he nailed. He paused and looked at the porch railing with the expression of a man measuring the distance between then and now. My wife passed around that same time. Grace. Earl never said much about it, but he started coming by more often after that. Bringing coffee, sitting on my porch the way we are sitting on his. Never mentioned Grace by name. Just showed up. Henry took a sip. Some people don't know how to say the thing, so they say it by being there. Your father was like that. May looked at Henry and saw something she had not seen before, or had seen but not named. He was not helping her because Earl had been a good neighbor. He was helping her because Earl had helped him, and this was how the debt moved, not in repayment but in continuation passed from one person to the next, like a current that does not stop when the river bends. He built things. May looked out at the property, always building, always working on something. He just never said what. Henry finished his coffee and set the mug on the railing and stood. Let's go look at that floor. Inside the shed, Henry moved the way men move in spaces they understand carefully, but without hesitation. He walked the perimeter. He knelt and studied the concrete, running his palm across the surface the way a doctor palpates a body, feeling for what the eyes cannot see. He knocked on the floor in several places, listening, his head tilted. When he reached the northwest corner, he stopped. He knocked again. He pressed his ear to the concrete. Then he sat back. There's something under here. He was quiet for a moment, processing. The rest of the slab sounds solid, probably 8 inches thick. But right here, it's thinner. Poured over something. A hatch, maybe. Or a door. Maybe. Henry stood and brushed off his knees. Only one way to find out. He set up the compressor outside the shed door and ran the pneumatic hose through the doorway to the hammer. The noise was enormous. A jackhammer concussion that bounced off the steel walls and came back doubled and redoubled, rattling the rusted tools on their hooks. May tied a rag over her nose and mouth and stood back and watched Henry work. He was methodical. He broke the concrete in a 4-foot square, starting at the edges and working inward, peeling away layers that crumbled into rubble and dust. 30 minutes. Then the chisel struck something that was not concrete. A metallic clang rang through the shed, sharp and clear above the hammer's roar, the unmistakable sound of steel meeting steel. Henry killed the compressor. The silence that followed was so absolute it had a physical presence like a held breath. He knelt and brushed away debris with his hands. May came closer. Beneath the broken concrete, dull gray steel glinted in the light that filtered through the damaged roof. It's a hatch. Henry's voice was calm, but his hands had slowed the way hands slow when they encounter something that demands respect. Steel plate, centimeter thick at least, looks military grade. They cleared more concrete, widening the opening until the full outline was visible. Roughly 4 feet square, set into a steel frame bolted to a concrete foundation beneath the slab. A heavy-duty combination lock secured the latch on the right side. The lock was not rusted. It was stainless steel. The one piece of this installation that had been built to outlast everything around it. Henry sat back and wiped his forehead. Your father put this here. If it was here when I was a child, I never knew about it. This is serious work, May. This isn't a farmer storing tools. Whoever built this planned for it to last. May reached into her jacket. The pocket watch was warm from her body heat. She turned it over and looked at the 5 numbers inside the cover. 5 digits scratched into silver by a man who had known that one day his daughter would be standing over a combination lock in a shed in Louisiana with nothing left to lose and everything left to find. Let me try something. She knelt beside the hatch. The combination lock had 5 positions. She dialed the first number to the left, the second to the right, the third to the left, the fourth to the right, the fifth 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 to fourth to the right, the fifth to the left. The lock clicked open, a small sound, the sound of a mechanism releasing after decades of stillness, the sound of a secret reaching the end of its patience. Henry looked at her. May looked at the lock. Her hands were trembling not from cold, not from effort, but from the sudden understanding that her father had planned this, all of it. The watch, the numbers, the vault, the waiting. The certainty that one day she would come here because she had nowhere else to go. Her voice was barely audible. That's what the watch was for. He gave it to me when he was dying, told me I'd know when I needed it. Do you want me to open it? No. May put her hands on the steel. It was cold under her palms. Cold the way earth is cold, the way buried things are cold, the way the past is cold when you finally touch it. This is my father's. Whatever's down there, he left it for me. I'll open it. The hatch was heavy. Henry helped her lift it, and it swung back on thick hinges that groaned with the voice of decades. Cool air rose from the opening, damp and sharp, carrying a smell May did not immediately recognize. Something herbal, something fermented, something old in the way that only carefully preserved things are old, not decayed, but deepened, concentrated, aged into a version of themselves that the original could not have imagined. Below, a steel ladder descended into darkness. 10 rungs bolted to the wall, each one solid and functional. Henry reached for the ladder. I'll go first. No! May gripped the top rung. The steel was cold and rough under her fingers. This is my father's. I go first. Henry handed her his flashlight without argument. There are moments when you recognize that someone has arrived at a threshold they must cross alone, and the only useful thing you can do is hand them a light. May descended. 10 rungs, each one solid under her feet. She counted them the way she used to count steps when she was a child descending into the root cellar, a small ritual of control in the face of darkness. Her feet touched concrete. She stood in the dark and turned on the flashlight and swept the beam across the space and stopped breathing. Shelves. Floor to ceiling, wall to wall, oak shelves built with the kind of joinery that does not use nails because nails are not strong enough and not precise enough for what is being stored. Thousands of glass bottles lined every shelf, brown and green and clear, each one labeled in handwriting. She recognized as her father's, each one sealed with wax. The labels bore dates and descriptions, some in English, some in a shorthand she could not decipher. But the dates she could read, and they spanned decades. 1954, 1959, 1963, 1971. In the far corner, small oak barrels were stacked 3 high, their staves dark with age. A workbench ran along the back wall, its surface clean and organized. Even after all these years, tools for bottling and sealing arranged in order of use, a scale, a set of funnels, glass measuring vessels. The air was cool and constant, the temperature regulated by 4 meters of earth above a natural cellar that any collector would have envied. On the workbench beneath a heavy glass bottle that served as a paperweight, a white envelope. May crossed the room and picked it up. Her father's handwriting on the front. One word, May. She opened it and read. The letter was written in Earl's hand, steady and deliberate, and shaped by a generation that understood penmanship as a form of seriousness. He addressed her directly. He told her he owed her the truth about why he had been the father he was, instead of the father she deserved. He told her he had started in 1952 after the war, when he had 60 acres that produced nothing, and a pregnant wife and a house without heat. He had learned from his grandmother, he wrote, a woman from the islands, who had taught him techniques for making sauces and fermented goods from swamp plants, methods that used time and temperature and patience in place of expensive ingredients. What the black market men paid 10 cents for, the restaurants in New Orleans paid $10. Earl had realized that what he made was different, not just seasoned but complex, layered, improved by aging in ways that only a handful of producers in the world understood. And May stopped reading. She was back in the church hallway at Walter's funeral. The organ music fading behind her, and the old man with liver spots on his hands was holding hers and saying words that had made no sense at the time. I bought from him 40 years ago. He was an artisan, not a farmer selling corn, not a neighbor trading favors, a buyer, a customer. The stranger had known what Earl was before May did. He had tasted Earl's work and remembered it 4 decades later, and come to the funeral of Earl's son-in-law just to say so. May looked at the rows of bottles on the shelves around her and understood that her father had not been a poor man pretending to be poor. He had been a rich man who chose poverty because wealth had tried to kill him. She returned to the letter. In 1954, Earl wrote he built the vault. 2 years of digging. Every shovelful of clay removed by hand. When it was finished, he had a room nobody knew existed beneath a shed on land nobody looked at twice. He produced for 19 years. Sauces, fermented goods, molds, artisanal vinegars. May's mother had known. She had helped with the bottling in the early years before her health declined. Then Earl wrote about 1968. A man named Vernon Tate, a distributor, a partner Earl had trusted for 10 years. Tate knew the products had value, but did not know where they were made or stored. When Earl refused to expand, refused to share formulas, refused to bring in outside capital, Tate turned, first threats, then blackmail. Then one night in October, Tate came to the property with 2 men. Earl did not describe what happened. He wrote only this: I did what I had to do to protect my family. I won't write the details. You don't need them. But then a sentence that made May's hands tighten on the paper, a sentence she would think about for weeks, turning it over the way you turn a stone that might have something underneath it. If you go to the southeast corner of the property near the bald cypress row, you'll find the reason I never planted anything there. Don't dig. Let it be. After that night, Earl shut everything down, sealed the vault, poured concrete over the hatch, never touched it again. He drove the same truck for 20 years. He wore the same boots until they fell apart. He showed the world nothing because a man who shows the world everything he has is a man who has already lost it. The letter ended with May's name and a single instruction. The bottles were worth money, real money. Artisanal condiment collectors, chefs, culinary historians, gastronomic archives. They would all pay for what was down here. But she must not let anyone take it from her. The people who love your money are never the people who love you. Trust the ones who show up when you have nothing. May folded the letter and pressed it against her chest. She sat on the stool at her father's workbench in a room 4 meters underground that smelled of oak and fermentation and decades of silence, and she held the letter and did not move for a long time. Then she climbed the ladder and closed the hatch and walked to the house and made supper. She did not sleep that night. She sat at the kitchen table with the letter spread before her and read it 4 more times, and with each reading something different surfaced. A phrase she had skimmed, a word choice that carried more weight than it appeared. By dawn she had a plan, not a grand plan, just the next 3 things she needed to do. The first was to find out what the collection was worth. May was no expert in artisanal gastronomy, but she had been a teacher for 37 years and she knew how to research. The library in Bardwell was small, one room with 5 computer terminals and shelves that smelled of old paperbacks, but it was enough. May spent 4 hours reading about the market for historic condiments. Bottles from artisanal productions of the 1950s and 1960s, if authentic and properly stored, sold for hundreds each, some for thousands. A single bottle of artisanal black mole from a historic production had been auctioned the previous year in Chicago for $72,000. May sat back and looked at the screen. 4,000 bottles, some nearly 70 years old, stored in conditions that a museum curator would have approved. The second thing she needed was an expert. Henry knew someone who knew someone. 3 phone calls and 2 days later, May stood in the vault beside Nadine Broussard, a gastronomic heritage appraiser from Baton Rouge, who had driven 90 minutes without asking what she would find. Nadine descended the ladder and stood at the bottom for 30 full seconds without moving, her flashlight beam sweeping the shelves, slowly, steadily revealing more with each pass. Then she walked the room. She pulled bottles at random, examined labels, held glass up to the light, inspected wax seals with a magnifying glass, took notes on a tablet. She did not speak for nearly an hour. When she finished, she sat in a chair May had brought down from the kitchen and rubbed her face with both hands, the gesture of someone recalibrating their understanding of what is possible. "Who made this, my father?" "Your father was a genius." Nadine's voice was flat with disbelief. "The aging process, the storage, the fermentation technique. I've seen museum collections with less care." "How much is it worth?" Nadine set the tablet on her knee. "I can't give an exact number without full testing. Authentication, chemical analysis, provenance documentation. But based on volume, age, and condition, we're looking at somewhere between $2 and $4 million. May did not respond immediately. She sat in the chair beside the workbench and looked at the bottles on the shelf nearest to her. A row of dark glass dated 1957, the year she had started first grade, the year her mother had walked her to the schoolhouse 3 miles down County Road 14, because Earl was somewhere he could not explain, and her mother had said only that Daddy is working, which May now understood meant Daddy was 4 meters underground, sealing wax on bottles that would outlast everyone who had ever touched them. Her father had been down here while she learned to read. He had been down here while she rode her first bicycle. He had been down here while her mother sat alone in the kitchen, waiting for him to come back up, knowing where he was keeping the secret, because that was what love looked like in their household. Not shared, but guarded, not spoken, but held. $2 to $4 million. Earl Dupree had mended his boots with shoe glue and eaten beans 5 nights a week and driven a truck that burned oil and rattled over every pothole on County Road 14. And he had done all of it sitting on a fortune that could have bought him a house in New Orleans and a car that worked, and a life without the weight of concrete and silence. But he had chosen the weight. He had chosen it because in 1968 a man named Vernon Tate had shown him what happens when other people learn the size of what you have. Don't flood the market, Nadine continued. A collection this size released at once collapses the price. Small batches, private buyers, select auction houses, 5 to 8 years. And if I need money now, Nadine considered. I can connect you with 2 or 3 private collectors who would buy 50 bottles tomorrow. Preliminary assessment, you'd get 120 to 150,000 for the first batch. Do it. Nadine left with 10 bottles for laboratory testing and the names of 3 collectors. May walked her to the truck. Keep this quiet. Discretion is my profession, ma'am. Henry was on the porch when May came back inside. He had not gone into the vault. He had not asked to. He had waited on the porch the way he waited for everything patiently without expectation, without the restlessness of a man who believes his presence entitles him to information. Well, 2 to 4 million. Henry did not speak for a long time. He looked at the fields, the shed, the overgrowth, the sky. Earl was something else. He was a frightened man who found a way to tell me he loved me, and it took his whole life to finish the message. The first sale closed within 2 weeks. 50 bottles to 2 collectors in New Orleans. $130,000 wired to a bank account May opened in Bardwell. She paid the $14,000 in back taxes. She hired a carpenter to repair the roofs. She bought a 12-year-old Chevy pickup with rust on the fenders and a solid engine. Henry helped her fix the fence and clear the driveway. She did not call Derek. She did not call Lynette. For the first time in decades, the silence felt like freedom rather than abandonment. The third thing she needed was the lawyer her father had mentioned in the letter. The office was on the second floor of a brick building above the post office on Bardwell's Main Street. The staircase was narrow and creaked on every step, and the door at the top had a frosted glass panel with the name Marchand and Associates stenciled in black letters that had faded to gray. The original attorney Earl had hired in 1980 was long retired, but his daughter had taken over the practice, a woman in her early 50s, with a wall of diplomas and a ceramic mug on her desk that read, "The law is what I say," and the particular unhurried competence of someone who has spent her career working cases that larger firms would not touch because the money was too small and the people were too far from anywhere that mattered. She found Earl's file in a cabinet in the back room. The folder was thick and yellowed at the edges. Inside were the trust documents, the property title survey maps, and a letter of instruction Earl had left with the firm 46 years ago. The lawyer spread the documents across her desk the way a surgeon lays out instruments. "This is an irrevocable living trust. Your father established it in 1980. The property, the land, all structures and all contents are held in trust for your exclusive benefit. You're the sole beneficiary. It cannot be amended or revoked by anyone, including you, without a court order." May asked the only question that mattered. "Can my children challenge it?" The lawyer read through the provisions carefully. "They could try. They would lose. The trust predates your marriage. It's separate property. Your children have no legal standing. If they argue undue influence or mental incapacity, they need medical evidence. And from what I can see, you're managing this property with more competence than most of my clients half your age." May thanked her, paid the consultation fee in cash, and walked back to the property. But silence from someone who used to depend on you is louder than any phone call. Lynette noticed first. She arrived on a Saturday in November, in a rental car, dressed in heels and a wool coat, picking her way up the gravel path as if the ground might bite her. She stopped at the foot of the porch steps and looked up at the fresh paint and the repaired fence and the truck. "You painted it?" "Just the front. Henry's helping with the sides next week." "Who's Henry?" "A neighbor." Lynette climbed the steps. She was trying to read May's face, searching for confusion or vulnerability or some sign that this was a mistake that could be managed. "Mom, where did you get the money for all this?" "I managed." You had $62 when you left Derek's house. 7 more questions followed. May answered none of them. Lynette drank coffee, declined lunch, hugged May briefly by the car and drove away. May watched until the car disappeared. Then she called Henry. Lynette was here. She saw everything. She's going to tell Derek. What do you think he'll do? What he always does. He'll try to take control. Derek moved fast. Property records from the county assessor's office, the trust, the tax receipts. He called the bank in Bardwell, but they told him nothing. He called the law office, and they told him the same. Derek understood contracts and leverage. He also understood when something did not add up. His mother had arrived with nothing, and now owned a functioning property with money in the bank. Either she had found resources he did not know about, or someone was exploiting her. He chose the second explanation because it was easier, because it made him the rescuer instead of the man who had put his mother on a bus with $62 and a suitcase. The truth was simpler and uglier. The jewelry shop was hemorrhaging money. The loan Derek had taken against the apartment was coming due. He needed capital, and his mother, who should have been sitting quietly in an assisted living facility reviewing brochures for activities she did not want to attend, was instead sitting on an asset he could not access. Derek did not hate May. He hated the gap between what he needed and what he could reach, and he filled that gap with the only tool he had ever trusted: control. The court papers arrived on a Monday in December. A process server drove up the gravel driveway, handed May an envelope, and left without a word. May stood on the porch and read the petition. Her son and daughter were requesting the county court to declare her mentally incompetent and appoint Derek as conservator of her person and estate, including all trust property. The petition cited her age, her sudden relocation to an isolated rural property, her unexplained financial activity, and her vulnerability to exploitation by unknown third parties. May read the papers twice. She folded them and walked inside and sat at the kitchen table. The fear she might have expected did not come. The hurt she might have expected had burned out weeks ago, incinerated by bus exhaust and cold nights. And the discovery that the man who had never told her he loved her had spent 2 years digging a room by hand to make sure she would survive. What she felt was clarity, clean and cold and useful. Her children had taken everything she had shared willingly. Now they were coming for the one thing she had not. She picked up the phone. "Henry, I need your help, and I need that lawyer." May prepared for the hearing with the same methodical attention she had once given to lesson plans. Her lawyer investigated Derek's finances. The results confirmed what May had heard through the bedroom door on the 15th night in his guest room. Derek had borrowed $280,000 against the apartment secured as a business expansion loan for the jewelry shop. But the shop's books showed no expansion, no new inventory, no renovations. The money had gone to personal debts, a second mortgage on Derek's own house, credit card balances, a car loan. The shop was 3 months behind on rent and 2 months behind on insurance. It was dying, and Derek had used May's apartment to prop up a life he could not afford to maintain. May kept this information. She placed it in the file her lawyer maintained and told her to use it only if the hearing required it. The weapon existed. May chose not to draw it unless she had to, not because she was merciful, because she was a teacher, and teachers understand that the most effective correction is the one you never have to deliver, the one that changes behavior simply because the student knows it exists. The hearing was on a Tuesday in January. May drove herself to the courthouse in the Chevy pickup, wearing a navy dress she had bought in town for $40 and her father's silver pocket watch pinned to her lapel. Henry had offered to come. May told him to stay. This was between her and her children. The courtroom was small, wood-paneled, lit by fluorescent tubes that hummed at a frequency just below conscious awareness. Derek sat on the left side with his attorney, a man in a dark suit with a leather briefcase and the practiced smoothness of someone accustomed to winning in rooms where his clients had more money than their opponents. Lynette sat beside Derek with her hands folded in her lap. and her face arranged into worried concern. The same expression May had seen her rehearse in mirrors since she was 16. May sat on the right side with her lawyer. She placed the document box on the table. It was cardboard, the kind you buy at an office supply store, and it contained everything May had done since arriving in Bardwell. Organized, chronologically documented, completely annotated in the clear handwriting of a woman who had spent 37 years grading essays and understood that evidence without organization is just paper. The judge was a woman in her 60s with silver hair and reading glasses on a chain. She read the petition in silence, turning pages with the deliberate pace of someone who has seen enough petitions to know that most of them are built on sand. Counselor, you filed for conservatorship based on alleged mental incapacity. What evidence are you presenting? Derek's attorney stood. Your Honor, Mrs. Colton is a 72-year-old woman who, following the death of her husband, abandoned her family home and relocated to an isolated, deteriorated rural property with no support system, no apparent income, and no clear plan. She has since engaged in significant financial transactions whose source her family cannot identify. We believe she is being influenced or exploited by unknown third parties. The judge looked at May. Mrs. Colton, do you have a response? May's lawyer stood. She was not fluid. She was not smooth. She was precise, and in a courtroom, precision beats performance the way a scalpel beats a sword. She opened the document box and began placing papers on the table. Medical records. A cognitive assessment from a licensed physician who had examined May 3 days earlier and found her alert, oriented, articulate, and in full possession of her faculties. The trust documents showing clear ownership of the property, bank statements detailed to the penny, tax payment confirmations, repair contracts, the truck purchase agreement, a timeline of every decision May had made since arriving in Bardwell, with supporting documentation attached to each entry like footnotes in a doctoral thesis. Mrs. Colton relocated to a property she owns free and clear, held in an irrevocable trust established by her father in 1980. She paid $14,000 in overdue property taxes. She restored the residence to livable condition. She purchased a vehicle. She opened a bank account and has maintained a positive balance. Every transaction is documented. Her physician has certified her as cognitively sound. There is no evidence of exploitation, confusion, or incapacity. Derek's attorney pushed back. The source of the funds remains unexplained, Your Honor. Mrs. Colton had virtually no assets when she left Metairie. May's lawyer did not hesitate. The source of the funds is the trust property itself. Mrs. Colton discovered assets left by her father on the trust land and has been liquidating them through legitimate channels. The trust documents state explicitly that all property and contents within the trust boundaries belong to the beneficiary. The funds are hers, legally, factually, completely. The judge turned to Derek. Her glasses were on now, and she looked at him over the top of them. Mr. Colton, do you have any medical testimony? Any physician statement? Any evidence beyond your personal concerns? Derek looked at his attorney. His attorney looked at the table. There was a pause that lasted 3 seconds and contained the full weight of a case built on nothing. No, Your Honor, not at this time. The judge removed her glasses. Then I'll be direct. She looked at Derek and then at Lynette, holding each gaze long enough for them to feel it. This petition has no medical basis. The respondent has demonstrated clear, consistent, and competent management of her affairs. I am dismissing the petition. She paused. Mr. Colton, I will also note for the record that filing a conservatorship petition without medical evidence wastes this court's time and causes significant distress to the respondent. I would encourage you to consider that before filing again. The gavel came down, a single sharp sound that ended something and began something else. May closed the document box, thanked her lawyer, and walked out of the courtroom. She made it to the hallway before Derek caught up. Mom. His voice was tight, the words pressed between his teeth. What assets? What did you find on that property? May turned. She looked at her son, 49 years old. The jaw was Walter's. The hairline was Walter's. The need to control everything within reach was Walter's. But the desperation underneath was Derek's alone, exposed now by the fluorescent light of the courthouse hallway, stripped of the suits and the legal pads and the careful language. Your grandfather left me something. How valuable? That's not your concern, Derek. His jaw tightened. I'm your son. Then act like one. The words landed in the hallway between them, and neither of them moved. May knew about the 280,000. She knew about the shop's failing books. She knew that the apartment she had lived in for 4 decades was serving as collateral for debts her son had accumulated by living beyond a life he had not earned. She could have said all of it. She could have watched his face change the way a landscape changes when a storm passes over it, everything exposed, everything flattened. She chose not to, out of a refusal to destroy her own child. She wanted him to wake up. Waking up requires the person to be alive. You took what you could carry, Derek. You just couldn't carry what mattered. She turned and walked toward the exit. Derek did not follow. She heard his breathing behind her, ragged and shallow, and then nothing. He stood in the hallway alone, not angry anymore, exhausted. For a moment he looked like Walter in the last years, the shoulders settling into a shape that had nothing to do with posture and everything to do with the weight of things a man cannot put down because he does not know how to admit he picked them up. Lynette was waiting at the courthouse doors. She had been crying. Not the way she had cried at the funeral, controlled and positioned. This crying was unmanaged mascara tracking down her cheeks in dark lines. Her nose red, her mouth pulled into the shape that grief takes when it is mixed with shame, and shame is winning. Mom, her voice broke on the single syllable. I'm sorry for the car, the accounts, the conservatorship. I knew it was wrong. I knew the whole time. May stopped. She studied her daughter's face with the same attention she had once given to students who came to her desk after class with confessions they could not make in front of their peers. Why did you do it? Lynette wiped her face with the back of her hand, a gesture so unpolished and so unlike her that it told May more than the words that followed. Derek said it was the practical thing, that we were protecting you. I wanted to believe him. I wanted to believe we weren't just taking. Yes, but you were. Yes. They stood in the courthouse lobby. People passed in both directions. May reached out and touched her daughter's arm. You can come back, Lynette, when you're ready to come back as my daughter, not as someone looking for what I have, as my daughter. Do you understand the difference? Lynette nodded. She could not speak. Then go home, think about it. When you're ready, you know where I am. May drove back to Bardwell in the dark. The headlights of the Chevy cut a narrow corridor through the January night, and the road was empty, and the fields on either side were invisible, and the sky was full of stars she had not seen in 40 years of city living. She drove slowly, not because the truck could not go faster, but because she was in no hurry. For the first time since Walter died, she was not moving towards something or away from something. She was simply moving through her own life at a speed she had chosen. Spring arrived on the property the way it arrives everywhere in Louisiana. Not gradually, but in surges, as if the season had been held back by a dam that finally broke. The swamp irises came first, pushing through the last of the winter ground along the driveway. Then the grass turned not uniformly, but in patches that spread and merged until the fields were continuous green. The air softened and thickened and filled with the sound of things growing. The house looked different now. 4 months of work had changed it from a ruin into a residence. The garden May had planted behind the house was beginning to produce tomatoes and peppers and okra and herbs she had started from seeds. May stood on the porch one morning with her coffee and looked at what she had built and felt something she had not felt in so long she had to search for the word. Satisfaction, not happiness, satisfaction. The quiet recognition that you have done work that matters and that the work has changed the shape of the world around you, even if the world is only 60 acres of Louisiana swamp. Her birthday had come in February without ceremony. Henry brought a lemon cake from the bakery in town. They ate it on the porch in the cold, sitting in two chairs that did not match, drinking coffee from mugs that did not match. And Henry said, "Happy birthday, May." And May said, "Thank you, Henry." And that was sufficient. There are relationships that do not require declaration, that exist in the space between words rather than inside them. And what had grown between May and Henry over 6 months of shared work and shared silence was one of those. He showed up. He helped. He left when the work was done. He asked nothing. When she needed him, he was there. When she did not, he was not. He understood that presence without demand is its own form of devotion, and May understood that accepting it was its own form of trust. One afternoon in March, May found Henry standing at the fence line, not working, just standing. His hands were at his sides, and he was looking south toward his own property, toward the house where he had lived with Grace for 31 years and lived alone for 25. May walked to the fence and stood beside him. She did not ask what he was thinking. She did not need to. There are silences between people who have both lost someone, and those silences are not empty. They are full of the specific gravity of absence, the weight of a chair that is never sat in, a name that is never called, a cup that is washed but never used. They stood at the fence for a long time. Then Henry picked up the post-hole digger and went back to work. And May went inside and made 2 cups of coffee and brought one out to the fence and set it on the post beside him and went back inside without a word. When she looked out the window 20 minutes later, the mug was empty. The collection sales had settled into a rhythm. Nadine Broussard managed the placement, small batches to private collectors and auction houses every few weeks. 400 bottles sold over 5 months. The income was steady, but the money had never been the point. The money was a consequence. The point was the room beneath the shed, the room Earl had dug with his own hands, the room that contained not a fortune, but an apology. Every bottle was a day he had spent underground instead of sitting with his daughter. Every label in his handwriting was a conversation he had not had. The vault was not his legacy, it was his confession. In April, May bought the old pharmacy on the edge of town. $65,000 for a storefront that had been empty for years. Its windows dusty, its sign removed, its interior stripped to bare walls and concrete floor. Henry spent 4 weeks renovating it. New flooring, fresh paint, lighting that was warm without being sentimental. A sign above the door in plain letters: Colton Community Aid. Below it, smaller housing assistance, legal referral, emergency support. The idea had come from a conversation at the grocery store with a woman named Ruth, 68 years old, recently widowed, whose adult son had transferred the title of her house into his name while she was still wearing black. Ruth had been living in a motel for 3 weeks, spending her dead husband's last insurance check on a room that cost $49 a night, trying to find a lawyer who would take her case without a retainer she could not afford. May had listened to her story in the cereal aisle, standing between the Cheerios and the instant oatmeal, and had felt something tighten in her chest that was not sympathy. It was recognition. The mirror was too clear to look away from. "I know exactly how that feels. Let me help you." That conversation became phone calls. Phone calls became research. Research became the storefront. May funded it from the collection proceeds and staffed it with a part-time social worker from the county and a retired attorney she found through the law school at the state university. The center opened without ceremony. No ribbon cutting, no press release. Just an unlocked door and a woman behind a desk who understood loss because she had survived it. Within a month, 15 to 20 people came each week. Elderly men and women whose children had taken their homes through power of attorney abuses and fraudulent deed transfers. Widows trapped in probate systems designed by people who had never been widowed. Veterans who could not navigate the bureaucracy that owed them benefits. People who had fallen through the gaps that exist in every system and that every system pretends are too small to matter. May did not counsel them. She was not trained for that. She connected them with people who could help. But she was present. Every morning she unlocked the door. Every afternoon she made coffee and sat with whoever needed to talk. Her value was not expertise, it was witness. She had been where they were. She had sat in a guest room and been handed brochures. She had signed papers she did not read because she trusted the hand that offered them. She had ridden a Greyhound bus with $62 and arrived in a town where nobody expected her and started over. When she told people that starting over was possible, they believed her because the evidence was sitting across the table from them in a navy dress with a silver watch pinned to her lapel. Henry volunteered Tuesdays and Thursdays. He handled intake paperwork and drove people to appointments in his truck. He never explained his reasons. He arrived, he worked, he left. Some people demonstrate their values through speech. Henry demonstrated his through the accumulation of small, consistent acts performed without commentary, the way a river demonstrates its direction not by announcing where it is going, but by continuing to flow. One evening after closing, they sat in the truck outside the storefront. The sun was low, and the shadows of the buildings stretched across the empty street, and the sign above the door caught the last light. 7 months ago, you got off a bus in Bardwell with a suitcase and $19. Henry shook his head slowly. Now you're running a community center. When you put it that way, it sounds improbable. It sounds exactly like something Earl would have wanted. May looked at the sign. He was afraid his whole life, afraid someone would take what he built. So he hid it, sealed it, buried it under concrete. And the whole time what he was really protecting wasn't the bottles. She paused. Some people love loudly. Others build you a vault and hope you find it. Henry's laugh was quiet, the sound of a man who appreciates truth delivered without excess. And you found it. With help. With a bus ticket and a pocket watch. May laughed. The sound surprised her. It was clean and unweighted, free of the freight that laughter had carried for the past year, and she let it happen without examining it. Lynette called on a Saturday in May. May was in the garden turning soil with a spade when the phone rang. "Mom, it's Lynette." "I know." A pause. "Can I come visit?" "Not for anything, just to visit." "When?" "Next Friday. Stay through Sunday." "The couch is all I have." "The couch is fine." She arrived Friday evening in a car that was not the one she had taken from May. She came alone. No Derek, no husband, no legal pad. A weekend bag and a bottle of wine that May set on the counter unopened, because she had more bottled goods than any person could consume in a lifetime. They sat on the porch. The evening was warm and the frogs were loud and the sky was the color of bruised fruit, purple and orange at the edges, darkening to black overhead. "It's beautiful." Lynette shook her head slowly. "I can't believe it's the same place." "It's the same place. It just needed someone to care for it." Lynette was quiet for a long time. Then she spoke, and her voice had the quality of someone who has rehearsed something so many times that it has passed through artifice and come out the other side as truth. "After the hearing, I went home and couldn't sleep for weeks. I kept thinking about what you said, coming back as your daughter. And I realized I didn't know what that meant anymore. I don't know when I stopped being your daughter and started being someone who just took. It happened slowly. Most hurtful things do. Derek and I told ourselves we were being responsible, managing the estate, protecting you. But we weren't protecting you. We were protecting ourselves from having to care for you. That's the truth, and I'm glad you can say it." Lynette stayed through Sunday. She helped May in the garden, kneeling in dirt in clothes that had not been chosen for kneeling. She visited the community center and sat in on a session watching May work with a 71-year-old man whose daughter had sold his house through a forged power of attorney. Lynette watched her mother explain the legal options with the patience and clarity of a woman who had spent 37 years explaining things to people who did not yet know they needed to understand. She did not speak during the session. She watched. And in watching her mother help a stranger reclaim what had been stolen from him, she saw what she and Derek had done reflected in a light that left no shadows. Before she left on Sunday, Lynette stood by her car and looked at the shed. "What's really in there, Mom?" May smiled. "Come back next time and I'll show you." Lynette hugged her, not the quick obligatory compression of the funeral or the courthouse. She held on. May held on back. The embrace lasted long enough for both of them to feel the architecture of it shifting the weight, redistributing the old structure, giving way to something that was not yet built, but had a foundation. "I love you, Mom. I love you too." Lynette drove away and May watched until the car was a point of light on the county road and then gone. May asked about Derek during the visit. Lynette's answer was careful. Derek had not called. He was angry. He felt humiliated by the hearing. May thought about her son, his pride, his need to control, his inability to admit fault. He was Walter in so many ways, and Walter had only learned humility when his body taught it to him, when the stairs became too steep and the walks became too short and the future contracted to the distance between his chair and the window. "I don't know if he'll come around, but the door is open. It's always been open. He just has to walk through it." Two signals arrived in the weeks that followed. The first was an envelope from Metairie, no letter inside, just a photograph. May and Derek, the year Derek turned 6, standing in front of the jewelry shop on the day Walter hung the sign. May was holding Derek's hand. Derek was looking up at the sign with the expression children have when they see something their parents have built and believe it will stand forever. The back of the photograph was blank. No words, no date, no explanation. May placed it on the kitchen windowsill beside Earl's pocket watch. The second signal came through the lawyer. Derek had formally withdrawn the conservatorship petition. No new filing, no conditions, no contact, just a signature on a withdrawal form and silence. May asked her lawyer if Derek had said anything. The lawyer said no, just the signature. May nodded. A withdrawal was not an apology. It might never become one. But it was a retreat from the position he had held, and retreat is the first thing that happens before a man turns around. Whether Derek would complete the turn was not something May could predict or control. Some doors stay open for years. Some people walk through them. Some stand on the other side and never cross. A mother's work is not to drag her children through the door. A mother's work is to leave it unlocked. On a late afternoon in May walked to the edge of the property where the land sloped down toward the creek she had discovered in January, frozen, then running clear now with spring water that caught the light and broke it into pieces. She stood there and looked back at everything. The house with its white paint and cedar porch, the shed with its secret underneath, the field stretching flat in every direction, green and alive and hers. She thought about Earl, a man who had dug a room by hand and filled it with the work of 19 years and then buried it under concrete and spent the rest of his life sitting in a chair, watching the door that hid it. She thought about Walter, who had worked hard and loved in his way, and never thought to protect her from the children they had raised together. She thought about Derek, whose photograph sat on her windowsill, a 6-year-old boy holding his mother's hand, unreachable now, behind walls of pride and debt, and the particular blindness that comes from believing you deserve what you have taken. She thought about Lynette kneeling in garden dirt in expensive clothes, trying to remember how to be a daughter. She thought about Henry, who was at the fence line right now replacing a post that had come loose in last week's rain, working without being asked. 73 years old, standing on land that was hers, surrounded by things she had built with her own decisions and her own labor, and the stubbornness she had inherited from a man who could not say "I love you," but could dig a vault 4 meters deep to make sure she heard it anyway. The pocket watch was warm in her jacket. She did not take it out. The 5 numbers had done their work. The combination had opened the lock. The lock had opened the vault. The vault had opened her life. May turned and walked back toward the house. The afternoon light was soft on the white paint, and the porch looked the way a porch should look, like a place where someone was going to sit down with a cup of coffee and watch the evening come. On the kitchen windowsill, the photograph of a 6-year-old boy caught the last of the sun. Beside it, Earl's watch rested on its side, the cover closed, the numbers hidden, their purpose fulfilled. She had been home all along. She just had not known it yet.